We're here today to explore what decolonizing data looks like. This is a relatively unexplored topic in a lot of ways. So it's been discussed in smaller forums, and we're really excited to kind of bring it to this broader space and have this conversation with you all. So thank you all for joining. The way that we think about it and what we've seen in our work at NextLeaf, data colonialism is when one entity, it could be a company, a nonprofit, a donor, a government, or a social enterprise, claims ownership of data that is produced by others or for others, and also takes most of the value of that data. In global health, we've been seeing this really disturbing pattern when even well-meaning researchers, bilaterals, NGOs, like I said, come into a country and collect data or take data collected by others, hold on to it, and then actually get that value. So often data is taken and analyzed in private without involving communities in that analysis. And just in its most basic form, we risk missing context about that data. But in the more extreme cases, data is taken without a community's knowledge or consent. And in the worst case, the data is never even publicly presented, but instead just analyzed and held. And those decisions are made based on data that impact countries or communities. So I'll give you one example to kind of bring this home. I've heard from a few ministries of health now. We work with a number of governments, and I've heard from ministries of health just the utter frustration to be sitting at a conference and seeing somebody stand up at a conference and present data about their country. And this Ministry of Health has never even seen this data, let alone even heard about it's being collected. And so in the more extreme cases, that data is sometimes not even presented in public, and that data is taken in private and decisions are made, and the country's just informed about it at the very end. To kind of take a step back in terms of how this relates to kind of traditional colonial behaviors, first we're seeing that first thing of like the resource being taken out or extracted from a country. And that resource is data, but it's also the learnings and the knowledge. And this is in cases where countries without country stakeholder knowledge or consent. Second, there are systems that reinforce this extraction of data. So whether it's in the sake of intellectual rigor, monitoring and evaluation, or simply just a for-profit business model, these are all systems that unfortunately can be used to reinforce this data extraction. And then third, often this data is collected by the countries, but then taken and analyzed or used outside of the country and not in direct benefit for that country. And in the extreme case, and we'll talk about this some more, the appropriated data is actually used directly against the country in a punitive way. We know that data is knowledge, is power, is money. And each step in this continuum has value. And when any step is sort of taken and put in a proprietary place, the real communities and countries who are impacted, they lose that value and lose a step in this process. And increasingly what we're seeing is that data is being concentrated in the hands of just a few people. And the people who own that data get the most direct benefits of that data, whether it's financial or otherwise. We've seen how data is being used to make important decisions, like to determine which countries or which initiatives get money, what should be scaled up. And like I said, this can be done in a punitive way. For example, when an organization performs a monitoring exercise, takes that data and just gives it straight to a funder without involving the country and stakeholders. And so that funder can decide to keep funding something or not. And it doesn't have to be this way. And that's what really gets me going. This is so avoidable in many different ways. From what we've seen, this could be done differently. If a country owns this data, a country gets to present that data, bring their context, gets to own and is empowered with it, then we can create a more shared blueprint where we're moving together, learning forward together, and then acting together. We focus on a number of things. We focus first on ensuring that countries actually own the data, that countries are making the decisions on how this data is used, how it's presented, when it's presented. And part of that is creating interoperability, open data standards. So at NextLeaf, we build real-time data platforms. We put sensors in vaccine fridges. We are looking at how do you actually help countries build stronger health systems, stronger vaccine supply chains. Some of us have now heard of the importance of keeping vaccines cold. It's starting to become relevant to all of us. It's something we've been working on for almost a decade now though. And so a critical part of helping to keep vaccines safe is the data that underlies that health system. And so we put real-time sensors in fridges. That data goes to all levels of the health system. And we really work to empower every level in the health system to make decisions based on that data. So from the healthcare worker at the facility, at the clinic, all the way through somebody at the National Ministry of Health, we're looking at how do you really empower people to incorporate data into their daily decision making. So it's not just about owning the data, but actually having the authority to act on that data and to know that when a fridge calls for help, somebody will have the resources to actually respond to it. So there's a lot that goes into that. Even if it's not intentional, it can still be incredibly harmful. And that's what's important here as well, is thinking about, we're here, we're trying to improve systems, all of that. But it's about kind of what happens along the way. And too often when you have data taken out of a country or community and used by outsiders to determine what's the most important problem to solve and then how to solve it, you also quite literally take that opportunity away from the people on the ground in the local context to actually develop those solutions. So there's kind of harm flowing in multiple directions here. First, we look at data ownership. So we look at articulating upfront who owns this data and who has access to the data and what are the mechanisms to enforce that ownership. Talk is cheap in this way. And so who's really making the decision about which data is released, how it's used, and how it's communicated? Second, we look at the benefits. So on top of ownership, who are the primary benefits actually accruing to, whether it's financial, intellectual, or operational? If benefits are not directly accruing to the people who supposedly own that data or the country or community, then we need to understand why. As partners, we're here at NextLeaf, we're here to support global health, and all of you are here in your specific spaces. So third, we look at actually how the decisions are made, because how the decisions are made are just as important as what the decisions end up being. So it's how are decisions made about the data or with that data? Are the decisions made by an exclusive small group of a few people? Is the country or community where the data was collected at the table when those decisions were made? And who's presenting the data? Who's even deciding that the benefits are sufficient? So there's many levels that you can kind of look at this question of like, how are the decisions made? And then finally, as we've talked about at NextLeaf, we actually go a step further. So we have issued a set of data rights. These are data principles that we adhere to. Encourage people to check them out on our website, where we stake country data ownership, we stake interoperability, all of that. But we also go a step further and we say that right now, data should not be punitive. We're just too early in our understanding of these flows of data, ownership of data, and knowledge in order to really understand how we can meaningfully use this data together in collective action. And so we're just too early for data to be used in this punitive way. So as a sector, we think, including funders, that we should be incentivizing high quality data use, because we think that's going to then collectively get us to that next phase where we are delivering on results and resilient systems together. Is what we're describing something that you've observed in your work? You look at country data ownership, and that's in our context, of course. There were some great questions and comments in the chat around community data ownership as well, and models for that. So that's, I think, a first step. Second, and very related, don't hold data hostage. So interoperability is a big part of this. We see all sorts of excuses for why data can't be interoperable. We don't have time, we don't have the resources. That's just not good enough anymore. So there's just no excuse for data to be held hostage in systems unless it's what the owners want and the rightful owners of that data. So really thinking about what it means to build interoperability in from the beginning, so that data is not isolated. So in the context of ministries of health where we work, ministries of health often have their own information systems that they want to use. So as a provider of a data system, our responsibility is to build that data in a meaningful way into their existing system. Third, we've also been, working with the global standards, because global standards, open data standards, that's a big part of this as well in terms of market shaping and creating that ecosystem. And so as part of all of this, we do whatever it takes to ensure that the data stays in the hands of the people and communities where it's collected. So where there's local control of not only the data, but the knowledge that's generated. We also look at what does it take to actually incorporate more collective and inclusive conversations in the interpretation of that data. And admittedly, I want to say we have not figured all of this out. These are questions that we're asking and challenging ourselves with at NextLeaf. But really excited to have this dialogue and to be challenged so that we are together kind of building that better system. One of the things that we talk about is that Silicon Valley business model of like holding on to data, keeping it proprietary. In some ways, it's like so last decade, but at the same time, it's still very present. And the direction that certain initiatives are going is around wanting to incentivize results, and that's a good thing. We all want to incentivize the right results. But unfortunately, sometimes we see that data ends up being collateral damage, and you get lower quality data as a result of jumping to that step when a market's not ready for it. And so really thinking about how do we actually incentivize high quality data? Another part is the knowledge. So a lot of this is just like based on this knowledge imbalance that then gets created and reinforced when you have all of the things that we're talking about. And we have to, be dealing with that knowledge imbalance as well, that sort of asymmetry of knowledge. And so looking at how do we create opportunities for local researchers and social scientists to produce and publicize this data, bring their context. And then finally, how do we kind of challenge our thinking and align incentives for high quality data, as we were just talking about? So where funding flows not just for specific outcomes, but for that really high quality data. Decolonizing data, this is not something that I came up with or that we came up with together, that there's actually work in this space. And from what I've seen, has really emerged actually from Indigenous group data rights and a few really fantastic organizations. So encourage people to also look up the hashtag Decolonize Data. And there's other resources as well, a few books that have been talking about this topic. I think what's important about this conversation here is that we're starting to broaden the definition to other sectors as well. Clearly, this conversation, this topic is resonating, and I'd put that out to others. I mean, this is us. This is all of us. So, it's on us to kind of really figure out how we want to take this forward. But a really important topic. For me, this topic is still emerging and showing itself. So this is like this critical time for us to be leaning into this discussion. We can shape it. We're kind of building the bridge as we go. And my concern is that if we don't address it, data colonialism reinforces itself and existing power dynamics. It's going to undo progress we've made. It's going to make other things that we're trying to do much harder. So I think it's something that we've got to like really just own, name, and really understand. Holders of data hold power. They make decisions. They reinforce their own privilege, the power, decision making. It's a vicious cycle. But what happens if we can break that cycle? It's not just about the data. The data is just a means to an end. So if we can get data back into the hands where it needs to be, we can advocate more powerfully for resources that are needed and design solutions that will work. So I'm super passionate about this topic. Obviously, we live and breathe data at NextLeaf. So yeah. I think these questions and comments that are being raised, these are so important. So I'm just super grateful to all of you just putting yourselves out there and joining us in this exploration.